Please welcome Gabriela Ramos, Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences at UNESCO, and Elizabeth Ranieris, Senior Research Associate at the Oxford Institute for Ethics in AI. This session will be moderated by Gina Neff, Director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge.
Welcome, thank you all. We're here to talk about what we think one of the most important questions that we can be looking at a conference on trust. And that really is this complicated, tricky relationship between human rights and digital rights. Are we doing enough in this moment to be bringing rights into our conversation about what we want for a digital future? I'm here with incredible panelists to have this fireside chat. Gabriela, what do you see as the biggest problem vis-a-vis rights and digital rights, human rights and digital rights?
That's a very big question, and I'm so glad to be with all of you and with this fantastic panelist. The fact is that this is not just another technology. This is the remaking of the world as we know it. And if we don't ensure that all the human rights that we have really enforced in the analog world are really respected in the digital world, we are going to finish with a world that is more divided, higher inequalities, discrimination, that is already being reproduced in the digital space if you don't have the ethical guardrails. At UNESCO, we have delivered a recommendation that probably you already saw somewhere, the copies, to look at these issues, particularly with the question of artificial intelligence, which is what powers the digital drive. And what we're seeing is that if you don't have these very concrete ways of ensuring the rule of law, human rights, human dignity, fairness, inclusiveness, sustainability, peaceful world might be at risk. And therefore, this is for us to put these pillars to ensure that these technologies just don't go on as they please, but that we really can channel them and they can help us solve our problems and not create more.
Elizabeth, how do you frame this problem?
Easy question to start off, right? So I agree with a lot of what Gabriela said. I also think that the digital has been somewhat of a distraction. I think that we have a robust body of human rights, everything from individual civil and political rights to economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think what I've noticed in the last 20 to 30 years in the digital realm is that we tend to focus on two rights: privacy and free expression. Those are obviously critical. They're fundamental rights. They're very important, certainly in an audience like this. But they're two rights out of 30 plus existing human rights that were the product of international deliberation and consensus building. And they're not perfect by any means, and it wasn't an inclusive process by any means, but they are sort of the closest thing we have to consensus at the moment. And I worry that when we really focus on the technology, we lose sight of the robustness of what we potentially have as an arsenal of tools. And so I think that talking about digital rights sometimes distracts us from the potential to really tap into what human rights could be properly adapted to digital tools and technologies, including artificial intelligence, and properly applied, of course. And it's a tenuous time to talk about human rights, so I want to acknowledge that as well. Our institutions are not perfect. They're obviously fragile, and they need to be defended and protected. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that they've been hard fought for, and that we should think about broadening the lens.
Well, let's talk a little bit about broadening that lens. Gabriela, you've done some work around expanding how we think about rights and artificial intelligence. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, this was a fantastic discussion because we just had it with 193 countries. And there you have some that wanted to use the ethical framework to do something else. At UNESCO, what we decided is that the ethical framework was really to reinforce the human rights framework as we have it, and also the human dignity. But we wanted to raise awareness, and this is relevant for the public here, that nowadays artificial intelligence is being used to take so many decisions in the government, in the private sector, whether your children go to a university or not, whether you get a loan or not, whether you get a job interview or not, and we don't know. And therefore, transparency is one of those issues. It's not about the human rights, it's about the outcomes that you want to have when you enforce human rights. Transparency is not always there because you never know whether it was taken with artificial intelligence or not, whether you were part of the data set that was used, whether the checkpoints that need to ensure that the algorithms don't reproduce the biases. These are also highly concentrated technologies, 5 countries in the world producing them, white men teams only, 22% of women are there in this world. So at the end, the question is, how do we ensure that whenever you are affected in your rights, in your fundamental freedoms, you have access to redressal mechanisms, and also you are informed, just being informed, that you're not talking to a person, you're talking to a chat box, or whether the financial sector that we know has some problems of inclusiveness that will deliver something. So we will be reproducing these issues. What we're doing at UNESCO is having, of course, these 193 countries, committing to, of course, avoid the misuse, massive surveillance, social scoring, micro-targeting, manipulation or abusing of the cognitive biases for other purposes, autonomy, fairness, all these things. But we're also translating this into policies. Because if we don't get this into policies, people say, well, big tech, we need to control big tech. This is not the question. The question is, where is the policies that will allow these technologies to address these issues in all the areas of work? The economy, health, well-being, education, communication. And then you need to be sure, because these technologies are so dynamic, you cannot codify everything. Mm-hmm. That would be impossible. But you can try to steal this ethical thinking, even for the environmental sustainability and the teams, and we're going to produce an ethical impact assessment. So I feel this is very important. We need to get rid, and we discussed this, Gina, of this narrative by which regulation will stifle innovation. And I will just say, the automotive industry, would you allow them to decide whether they put any safety rules? You will not. And therefore, yes, there is a balance. You cannot over-regulate, you cannot over-codify. But the reality is that we have been in a world that has been completely lacking these guardrails in a way that is internationally acceptable. And we hope that this will help change this narrative and ensure that regulation is actually good for innovation, good for companies. They will have more certainty, and probably those that behave well will be rewarded.
Elizabeth, you've talked about this, expanding this notion of digital and data rights, and you alluded to, there's more than 2 rights, privacy and freedom of expression. Can you talk a little bit more about, what does an expanded notion of rights approach to the digital look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. In some ways it's expanded. In some ways it's going back to sort of, again, the core body of human rights that exist. But a great example, I think, right now, and particularly with respect to artificial intelligence, is around the freedom of thought and conscience. So we are increasingly living in a world where everything's mediated by algorithms. As Gabrielle explained, we often don't understand what the parameters are. We don't know how they work. We don't know why decisions are taken. And we often have very limited recourse. If you think about the scale of that, and recently in the news you've probably seen a lot about things like generative AI, which are things that are, you input text and it spits out an image or a video, things like DALL-E and other tools, which are becoming very widespread and very mainstream and increasingly cheap and efficient, which means that they will scale. I think there is a concern that things like the freedom of thought, which is a human right that frankly was taken for granted. I think there was an idea that how could anyone possibly interfere, right, with the internal realm? It wasn't conceivable. And so it's not necessarily that we need a new right to the freedom of thought or conscience, but it's that we need to reinterpret and adapt it in a way that makes sense in the context of these new and emerging technologies. So for example, I know there are scholars at Columbia and the Neural Rights Initiative who are thinking about adapting sort of the freedom from interference and freedom from manipulation. And really, it's, really clear example, I think, of this in my mind is that data protection really, which has become a very prominent right in this conversation, derives from the right to privacy, right? So it's not necessarily that we need to throw the whole thing out and start over again. I think we need to be more creative about, again, how we sort of characterize and interpret and apply and enforce, of course, because that's the most important part, really, of these rights in respect of these new technologies, and not just get so caught up in the shiny tech that we forget, that for humans to be at the center, it means that we're not talking about protecting and securing data, but we're talking about protecting and securing people. And I think that when we get down the path of these new rights, we often lose sight of humans really being at the center. And I've got a book coming out on this called Beyond Data, which I didn't mean to plug, but I think that really the premise there is that in some ways, this focus on data protection, again, has made us lose sight of, but what's really happening? Okay, great, the data's secure, it's protected, but how's it being used? And even if it is, there are increasing technologies that can be used to sort of ensure the security and privacy of data, but what's the ultimate outcome? How are we being manipulated? How are we being persuaded or meant to act in a community? And those are really important questions that I think go beyond, again, the sort of narrow lens that we've traditionally applied.
Gabriela, you've had to really work with a lot of different states that have very different agendas in this space, in this domain. And what has a rights-based approach done for you and for UNESCO in terms of bringing people to the table?
I think it's exactly what you were saying, Natalia, because the fact is that it can become very philosophical in the sense of, are we really being well protected when you think about the human-centered approach? The reality is that we have a set of human rights that need to be protected, period. And you will be not surprised, but when we started negotiating it, European countries were very worried about the ethical framing because they thought that this was going to be used to say, let's forget about the human rights, let's just look at the ethical question. And ethical questions are cultural driven, and it depends where you're born, what's your religion, and how you see things. The beauty of the human rights-based approach in UNESCO, and this is just the latest deliverable, because we have worked with the human genome, we have worked with many other technologies, we have actually this ethical approach, is to say, no, any ethical reflection that doesn't need to be codified, because at the end is for humans to have this moral ground to decide whether, if I do it this way, I'm going to hurt some, should I don't? So this reflection needs to be there. But let's not fool ourselves. There is a body of human rights that are already codified, and we start by that. And we started by that, which is very interesting. I'm not going to preclude if some members think that the current human rights framework does not cover for certain things. Chile just legislated neural rights, because it's true. You interact with these technologies, they can capture your emotions. They can profile you. You were fast, you were excited, you were looking for things. And then, of course, there is a positive to enhance the human experience and provide with good services appropriate to your tastes. But then there is also the question of all this fear, misinformation that is fueled and that is hurting our democracies. So at the end, do we need to codify neural rights? Maybe. What did Chile do? It's true, it's freedom of thought. We have it there, it's not that we don't have it. What they did was to say, they cannot be commercialized. It's exactly what you're saying, adapting it to a world that needs much more detail on how are we going to apply the human rights that we know. And I completely agree that there should be a law that should say my information of how I thought and how I feel should not be commercialized. And therefore, I think that this is very important. I have to say that I was really proud to see that all of the countries approved the banning of massive surveillance, the banning of social scoring, the banning of providing legal personality to these developments. Now, of course, the proof of the pie is in the eating, because we're going to need to work with all the countries. And at the end, Gina, it's also the case that I'm of course, big tech, it's one problem, and I think that this power distribution needs to be addressed, but this is for governments to do. These technologies in the hands of autocratic governments is very worrisome. And I think that we really need to build this global effort to ensure that these issues are treated with these guardrails that we developed.
Elizabeth, let's bring you into this. If we were to think concretely, what do we see that's working? What's working now?
Yeah, it's a challenging question. I think the techlash, helped. I think I don't know if the panel was before us or after us on Cambridge Analytica. I think there is a growing awareness. There's a sort of public consciousness around how what's happening now is not okay, right? I think people have seen, unfortunately, the more direct impact, some of the direct harms as these technologies scale. There are more and more examples of whether it's people being denied social services or, as you mentioned, the employment context. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes the real experience of those harms to have that pushback. But I think that it has been effective, and we're seeing this across different mechanisms, including organizing in labor. I mean, we're seeing sort of a resurgence in unions. We obviously have more and more proposals on the table from law and policymakers. I mean, the EU is rolling out a really comprehensive package of new laws and regulations in respect of all of these technologies, including an Artificial Intelligence Act. So I think, as Gabriela mentioned, all industries go through this period. Automobiles went through this, chemicals went through this, before they're regulated. When we buy into this narrative that, regulation will kill innovation, and then we start to see the harms, and then we sort of decide, right, that's just not going to work, and it's time to really take the reins. And I think we are at that turning point, and there's a tremendous opportunity now to sort of build on that momentum and to build the consensus that we need internationally, regionally. So I think that's really promising, just that, that awareness. It is challenging because I think the rate of change, these technologies are really coming down quickly. However, if we don't get caught up in the shiny new toy and we go back to first principles and we think about the rights that we already have, I think that goes a long way towards making us feel more empowered to address all of these issues and concerns.
Gabriela, from your perspective, you have such a wonderful scan of the globe. What's working?
Well, that's the beauty of multilateral institutions. We have many problems with multilateral institutions. And sorry, I said Natalia, you're Elizabeth, I'm crazy, but I was talking to somebody else. No, the point is that having member states getting together to understand the core of the issue, which is the very basic tenet of the rule of law. Whenever there is harm, there should be redressals. And I think this is so basic. When you're harmed, you need to have a channel to go. And I think this is one of the most important elements that came out from UNESCO discussions. Because it's so, we know there's a lot of lack of transparency. The fact that you have the code, and then the code is an IPR protected, and therefore it's a commercial trade secret, and then well, that's one important element, because yes, you don't want to just go and take any innovation and don't support those that develop it. But at the end, if there is harm, if you are harmed in your rights, in your integrity, in your human dignity, if you're manipulated, and you demonstrate, if you are not given an opportunity because you were not represented in the data set, or because the people that did it, as in Google, when they did this recruitment tool, and that did not only not consider women, but discriminated against women, who did that? I think we have that, and this is something that I feel we are looking at. The most important challenge, and I feel that we will be learning, for example, from Denmark, that has already instituted an institute to look at the transparency of algorithms and understanding this. It's the capacities of governments to deal with this, because this is very, very complex. It's not that we will have all the answers and the policies will come. You need to have public officials that understand that. I was even surprised to talk to a US senator 3 months ago that told me that he was very happy because he has just passed a bill of training for public officials in the US. Mm-hmm. What are we going to do with Africa or Latin America? But it's these policy-driven elements that will help us define the issues and ensure that whenever there is harm, there is redressal. We are not going to be controlling everything. We can't. We cannot be looking at every single technology, how it goes. But at the end, you need to have these recourses, and I think this is what really works, because it redresses the situation and it holds accountable whomever is developing these technologies.
I think that's, I mean, it's really hard work, right? I mean, I was recently at a workshop with a First Nations Australian who reminded those of us not from Australia, not familiar with the concept of terra nullius, right? The legal principle that colonial powers declared Australia simply empty and thus imported law from another realm onto it. And now there's a wonderful and rich conversation, rights-based conversation, about how we would challenge imperial law and its traditions, because it was never an empty space. And we used this as a metaphor in the workshop. We said, okay, what's happening now in our digital realm is a kind of declaration of terra nullius by those who design it, right? The metaverse, Meta is advertising, is a place where it's free. There are no rules. We just heard a panel, a fireside chat before us about decentralization and Bitcoin and this idea that there are no rules, so it's just empty. Let's build without it. And yet, Gabriela, you know, the idea of taking the laws, the principles, and the rights that we have and stitching them together with the emerging problems from new digital technologies, that actually takes a lot of work. Elizabeth, you've been
I just want to react to what you just said, because I think that the advantage we have this time around is it's the same narratives we had around the cyber libertarians. It's the same narratives we had around John Perry Barlow. It's the same narratives that we had that the digital realm is separate and apart. And I think that having lived through that and seen the results of that sort of approach, I think means that this time we're equipped to challenge those narratives, to push back against those narratives, to say that, hang on, increasingly there's really no separation, right, between this notion of online and offline, or those are sort of false binaries that don't serve us in any way, because even these proposals around, you know, things like online harms legislation, they're not online harms, right? They're very real to the people who are harmed. So I think that the way we frame these narratives really allocates power. And it either allocates power to the status quo, in some cases big tech, but I think that big tech's actually, you know, not as big if you think about really the universe of things like IoT and things that are being rolled out. But I think that it also could allocate power in the favor of those who traditionally haven't had it, if we reframe the narratives, if we push back on, again, the recycled sort of idealistic narratives that we heard when this notion of the internet was really emerging. So I think we have that benefit of hindsight. And I think one of the things I'm really concerned about, for example, and Gabriela alluded to this, is the idea of robot rights. You know, we aren't enforcing human rights. We're not enforcing women's rights, right? The notion of robot rights is really this, it's completely the example that you point out, which is we have this new uncharted terrain, and we should give legal personality to, and I, as a lawyer, I reject that. I think that doesn't make any sense, certainly not at this stage. And I think it takes us down a dangerous path again, where we lose sight of our humanity. So, I would say I think there are probably a lot of journalists at this conference, and I think it's important that we think about the narratives and the language that we choose. And I think that journalists have a huge responsibility in that. I think the way that these technologies are covered is often like they're magic, and this gives governments and other stakeholders the perception that they're magic and doesn't make them feel like they can push back or challenge them. But often when we're talking about something like artificial intelligence, it's really not even artificial intelligence, right? it's machine learning, and sometimes it's not even machine learning, it's heuristics, and sometimes it's even more basic than that. So I think this point on the narratives is just one that I really like to emphasize and completely agree with what you said.
And I'm sorry, but we are agreeing among ourselves. That's beautiful. We could be disagreeing, but the fact is this human-centric. Right. Because another narrative is, oh, it's a black box. Yes. These computers talking to each other, who understand them. At the end, they come up with something, and who knows? There's always a human in charge, and there is always the human who decides whether a technology that was developed is used or not. And I think this is super important, because if not, we hide behind the code or the machine learning, or no, and it's not the case. I think that we really need to hold the responsibility, because it's us who do the training of the machines and all of that.
So what do we need to do to get people ready for the future?
Be knowledgeable of these things, please. Whenever you connect to the computer, know that behind there are many things happening. Whenever you're triggered, I mean, this is as basic as that, because we also need to protect ourselves. You need to protect your children. You need to understand what is behind. But it's also very important that we hold accountable anybody that is related to the development of these technologies, and that we make sure, and the journalism that can help us communicate the downside risks of these technologies that we have been discussing. We are not against them. I think that what we really want to have, it's a world where these technologies are helping us with the climate transition, with the inequalities, and not reproducing them. So I think that get aware, and I really thank the foundation, Thomson Reuters, because we really need to get aware. We need to reproduce this message.
Yeah, I think the awareness is big. I think the counterpoint to that, I would say, is that it's not on each of us as an individual. I mean, in some ways it is in respect of our decisions, daily decisions, but I think that getting organized and getting active and getting political and really demanding more of law and policymakers, I think, is critical, because these are collective issues. You know, I mean, anyone who's been on social knows the concept of network effects, and so you can opt out if you will, but there won't be anyone there with you, right? And so these things are a choice until they're not a choice. And the way that happens is we buy into this idea that they're inevitable. And again, I challenge us individually to push back on the narrative of inevitability, because none of these things have to be the way that they are. They were decided by a handful of men, frequently in my home country. And I think, you know, they're worth being challenged. And so I think imagining different futures, bringing obviously different voices to the table is critical, but ultimately it's a collective challenge, I think, to get organized and to really reinvest in our institutions, frankly, and empower institutions. I'm concerned about, again, this sort of narrative coming out of Silicon Valley around decentralization, which really pushes back on the notion of institutions and collective action, and really serves the status quo in power. So again, when we look at Web3, when we look at the metaverse, you know, none of these narratives are new. They're slightly tweaked, but we've been there before. We know where it went. We know we can have a sense of where it will go, and this time we're more empowered. And I think that, you know, we've got a lot of people working on this that that are aware of that history, and that that hopefully are more equipped to help us push back.
We've had the phrase, you know, too big to fail. I think in this space we often say it's too complicated to rein in, right? And a wonderful metaphor that the AI researcher Stuart Russell has used is, imagine if the world's asphalt engineers were entrusted with the decision of where to lay asphalt, right? Just trust us, we can pave your beaches. It'll be fabulous, right? You know, we know what we're doing, and that's kind of the conversation that we're having now, and I think that's why events like this and the Thomson Reuters Foundation, people coming together, understanding that it's actually quite simple, right? There are these questions and these old questions about power that we need to unpack. In our last minute, what's the charge to the people in the room? What would you like to see them do? Gabriella first.
I would love that, now agreeing with Elizabeth, that they help us communicate these messages. It's not to be anti-tech, it's to be conscious on our responsibility as individuals, but also as institutions, and demanding governments and journalists to communicate what are the downside risks. of increasing discrimination, of lack of inclusiveness, and the need to fix it. I think we need to fix it.
We need to fix it.
Ooh, tall order. Absolutely pushing back on the narratives is crucial. Recognizing that this is not on you as an individual, that there's a collective action problem here as well. And really imagining a future where technology isn't designed to extract and surveil, right? But is designed to support and to promote our well-being. I think there is another path forward.
And with that, I want you to join me in thanking our panel, and thank you for being here.